Welcome to World History. Today we're going to stay with the Qing dynasty and look at the ways in which the Chinese tried to respond and react to this European encroachment on their territory and the massive sort of injustice of the Treaty of Nanjing and the Great Tea Robbery. So today we're going to look at the causes of the Taiping Rebellion, which I mostly just listed. We're going to assess the successes and failures of the Tongji Restoration and explain the cause and effects of the Yehitian movement. So let's dive into our story. The Taiping Rebellion was an anti-foreign, anti-Qing rebellion that started sort of in central China here, led by Hong Jiquan, who grew up a peasant but became an important religious and political leader. Both promising, one, land distribution for the peasants, and also preaching a version of Christianity that involved him being also the brother of Jesus and the Son of God and writing his own scriptures. And so at first, a lot of the Western powers saw Hong as potentially an ally and an opportunity to convert China to Christianity. But as he started writing his own scriptures, they sort of moved away from this and ended up not supporting the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom and backing the Qing dynasty instead. But Hong was still incredibly effective, donning the yellow of the emperor, declaring himself the son of heaven, and declaring his new kingdom, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. He raised huge amounts of followers from disaffected Chinese people, taking almost all of the Yangtze River Valley and the surrounding provinces, and capturing the capital of Nanjing itself. This could have been a moment where the Qing dynasty loses the mandate of heaven, reasserts control over the government, and is able to throw off the yoke and is able to throw off the Manchu yoke and sort of create a Chinese dynasty for China. But Hong, for some reason, sort of lost momentum after he took the capital of Nanjing. And so he took the capital, and then he became increasingly reclusive and focused mainly on his many wives and the scripture that he was writing. And so eventually his peasant army just sort of melted away on account of the fact that they needed to eat food. And the remnants of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom ended up starting to fall apart. This civil war was incredibly bloody, and the conquest was incredibly bloody, with the cost being upwards of 100,000 lives by the end. But the Qing dynasty was able to re-exert control by building a Western military led by sort of a Western military leader. And so the Qing Empire, in order to put down this Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, ended up recruiting a guy named Charles Gordon, also known as Charles Chinese Gordon, to lead what becomes known as the Ever Victorious Army. This Chinese army that will be armed, outfitted, and trained in Western styles of modern combat. And so, with this, they are able to crush the Taiping rebels. And again, at the cost of approximately 100 million lives, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom is put down, and the Qing dynasty is able to continue, albeit on life support. Obviously, all of these problems, plus China's massive weakness in the face of Western encroachment, means that China needs to adapt in order to survive. And so the young emperor who takes the throne in the 1860s, the Tongji emperor, starts this process of self-strengthening, with the goal being to modernize the tax system, build modern warships and a modern army, and build a new educational system that will actually help train the Chinese people in these modern ways, modern farming techniques and modern military techniques. So beyond the Tongji emperor, Prince Gong and Zheng Guofan are the two sort of architects of this whole movement, and they do put some of these things into practice. They are able to modernize the tax structure and get more money in. They do buy modern warships and weapons, but they really struggle to modernize the education system, to teach the Chinese people how to use these new techniques, because the traditions of Confucianism are very deeply embedded within the Chinese sort of consciousness. And so to a real extent, traditional Chinese education is part of what makes Chinese people Chinese. And so they really struggle to adapt to those pieces. And then the Tongji emperor dies. And his mom, the Empress Shiji, takes over And she is much less interested in these reforms. And so instead of money going to education and these other places, she spends it on building a fabulous palace for herself, and most famously, a marble boat, which turns out to be so heavy that it actually can't float. And so we now have, as opposed to spending money on training our Navy, we instead have a boat made of marble, which, man, it's kind of ironic. As far as like important things you could spend your money on, marble boat is about on the same par as a massive tomb. And so, man, some similar lessons that are going to be learned here. The absolute failure of the Tongji Restoration is highlighted in the War of Jiwu, which is also known as the First Sino-Japanese War. And we'll talk more about this from the Japanese perspective. But turns out the Chinese army, when they're without Western sort of officers, is really poorly led. And they, in general, when faced with an incredibly well-led, well-trained Japanese army, break and run. And the Chinese are driven off both the island of Taiwan and out of the Korean peninsula as the Japanese start to build their own spheres of influence. This is also the first example of the Japanese treating Chinese prisoners incredibly harshly, partially due to sort of bloodlust and partially due to sort of the Bushido warrior spirit of the Japanese that, again, we'll talk more about when we get into Japan. And probably the worst humiliation for China is the fate of the Beiyang fleet, because China just spent a ludicrous amount of money to buy a modern battleship fleet from English and German sources. And when they meet the Japanese fleet in battle, although the Chinese fleet is more advanced and numerically superior, the Japanese are able to utterly destroy the Chinese fleet because they are much better at operating their ships. Their marksmen are much more accurate. And quite frankly, the Chinese, just buying this technology isn't enough. You have to train your people to use it effectively. And so the Beiyang fleet finds its way to the bottom of the East China Sea, and all of that money is now completely wasted. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Japanese try to take over a significant portion of China, including the entire Liaodong Peninsula and the city of Dalian. But the Western powers step in and prevent them from doing so, worrying that the Japanese influence will grow too strong and it will force them out of Asia. And so we'll talk about the Japanese perspective of this. From the Chinese, this is a lifeline because they get to keep holding on to their territory. And they basically get one more chance to try to modernize. And so we start to see what's called the 100 Days Reform, with the Emperor Guangxu launching this this platform to, again, try to change education, to really modernize the Chinese state, to provide some democracy. We start to see revolutionaries thinking that maybe the Qing dynasty can't modernize, and we'll talk more about Sun Yat-sen in some later lectures. But all of these changes really start to offend the conservative parts of Chinese society, and a lot of Chinese people start to see this idea of modernization as giving in to foreigners and sort of abandoning traditional Chinese culture. And so, in the end, Cixi has a coup and locks the Guangxu emperor in his room, where he is unable to continue his reforms. And the Yehitian movement begins. This is an anti-Western, anti-modernization, anti-Christian movement around the sort of northern capital of Beijing. This rebellion is also sometimes known in the West as the Boxer Rebellion, because they practice traditional Chinese martial arts and what was known as Chinese boxing to Westerners. And so they kill missionaries, they kill Chinese Christians, and they are tacitly supported, sort of low-key supported by the Qing government, who sees this as a way to maybe mobilize a popular uprising in order to reassert control over their territory. Unfortunately for the Qing dynasty, the Western powers aren't going to take this lying down. And although the Boxers or the Yehitian are able to have some early successes, very quickly a 8-nation army led by England, Russia, Japan, the United States sends some troops, comes in and crushes the Boxers, leaves the Qing dynasty intact with, I think, a 4-year-old at this point on the throne, and reasserts control over their spheres of influence. The real effect is that Russia really starts to take control of much of northern China, much to the chagrin of the Japanese. Russia gets the Liaodong Peninsula, which Japan had wanted for a very long time, and they also get to take over Manchuria in order to build railways through it, because Russia was looking to connect its vast empire through the Trans-Siberian Railway, which means running a railway through Manchuria. In fact, the northern Chinese city of Harbin was actually constructed mostly by Russians, and so we've got some fabulous Russian Orthodox churches there, which seem very out of place in northern China, thousands of miles away from Moscow or St. Petersburg. So that's the story of China. We'll leave the Qing dynasty on life support with a 4-year-old on the throne for now, and hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail we'll move across the Straits of Tsushima to Japan for next time.